A cell is a living thing, even though if we think about a skin cell, it doesn't really exist on its own. It's part of our organ, part of our tissues, but it is a living individual cell. And so that cell goes through a cycle, its life cycle. It's a set of stages from the first time it divides until it divides again. There are two major stages of the cell's cycle. One we call interphase, and one we call the mitotic stage or mitosis. The mitotic stage also includes the cell dividing its cytoplasm in a process we call cytokinesis. And so mitosis is dividing the nucleus, cytokinesis is dividing the cytoplasm. You actually have to pull apart from the other cell and become two new cells. And so interphase is part of the life cycle. The second part is mitotic stage. Before you grow and divide, you have to grow a little bit larger. You have to make some more organelles. If you're going to duplicate, you have to duplicate your DNA because we're talking about mitosis, and so we want an exact copy. And so if we're cutting ourselves in half, we want an exact copy, we have to double everything. Otherwise, we reduce, and that's not mitosis, that's meiosis. We're not reducing, we're making an exact copy. And so this chart or this picture is a good way to study the cell cycle. The cell goes through several different periods within interphase. These stop signs will become important in the next couple of slides. They're what we call checkpoints to make sure things are going okay. The cell can check itself. Notice this little loop over here. So we've numbered all of these things, and we're going to learn all of these different terms, but out here, this little loop called G0. In this phase, the cell is not part of the cycle. It's not dividing. It's doing its main functions. It's doing what it's supposed to do. Because if you're dividing, you cannot be worried about anything else but making sure everything is separated completely. You can't do your function as the liver cell or as the skin cell or whatever you're supposed to be. And so this part is outside of the cell cycle. Some cells never actually divide or don't do so readily, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Let's talk about interphase first. Most of the cell cycle is spent in interphase. Highlight that, underline it, whatever you need to do. Most of the cell cycle is spent in interphase. It's the longest part of the cell cycle. Here we're duplicating our organelles and our DNA, but we're still able to perform our usual functions. The amount of time you spend in interphase depends on the cell type, but it's still the longest part of the cell cycle. So most of the cell cycle is spent in interphase. We can separate it into three different phases or stages, things we call G1, S, and G2. G stands for gap, but I think of it as growth to help me memorize it, but it stands for gap, gap 1 and gap 2. But if you think G growth, that might help you remember what the cell is doing. And S stands for synthesis. There's another little caveat down here at the bottom. Nerve and muscle cells do not complete the cell cycle. Sometimes in this class we get kind of the generalization. It's called general biology, and we don't go into the intricate details. This is not true for every single nerve and muscle cell. But for the most part, nerve and muscle cells do not complete the cell cycle. Your muscle cells do not divide. They can tear and repair. We can grow more fibers. They can get bigger, relatively speaking, but those cells do not divide in a usual system. You have so many, and that's what you have to deal with. Your nerve cells do duplicate in the beginning. You have a ton when you're first born, and in the next couple of years, they die off until they make nice, strong connections. We only focus on the important things. But for the most part, your cells don't divide. And there are a lot of reasons for that and a lot of reasons why they don't. That's beyond the scope of this class. But just remember, for the most part, nerve and muscle cells do not complete the cell cycle. They remain in the G0